Good morning. Today is Thursday, July 13th, 2023. Jewish law structures mourning in stages. There is a stage of onain. We discussed this yesterday. The period of time for a mourner between the death, the passing of their loved one, their relative, and the funeral, that immediate phase. Then there is Shiva, a 7-day period of mourning. Then there is Shloshim, that refers to the first 30 days of mourning. For any relative other than parents, that's the end of the mourning period. For a parent, there is 11 months, which is the amount of time that a child says Kaddish for a parent. There is 12 months, which is the period of time that children are in mourning, certain mourning practices for a parent. Then there's Yartzeit, which means to observe the anniversary of the date of death each year. So there are all these stages. And those stages, which we're going to discuss in detail over the next number of days, those stages are meant to guide a person from loss to nechama. Now, nechama we translate as consolation, but we're going to define that more precisely later on. Not everyone follows these stages in order, and certainly not everyone follows this timetable. Everyone's mourning is unique. But the point of this is that there are stages. There is an evolution and unfolding of this process, and that concept is critical to what Jewish law and Jewish tradition has to offer to one who has suffered such a loss. Now, these stages are approximately reflected in the 3-week period, which we find ourselves in the middle of the 3 weeks. Starts with the fast day that we had last week of Shivasa B'Tammuz, the 17th day of Tammuz, until Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which commemorates and mourns the destruction of the first temple and the second temple and other catastrophes. So this period of 3 weeks, so there are stages. There's the 3 weeks that start from the 17th of Tammuz. That's what we're in now. Then comes the 9 days. That starts this coming Wednesday, which is Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the Jewish month of Av. That's another stage. Then there is Erev Tisha B'Av, the afternoon before the 9th of Av. That's going to be Wednesday afternoon, July 26th. Then there is the night of Tisha B'Av and the morning of Tisha B'Av. That's another stage. Then there is the afternoon of Tisha B'Av, another different stage. And then after Tisha B'Av comes Nechama, comes consolation. The Shabbos after Tisha B'Av we refer to as Shabbos Nachamu, the Shabbat of comfort or consolation. So again, each one of these stages has different rules, but there's one major difference between the stages that apply to an individual who is suffering the loss of a loved one and the stages that we as the Jewish people are going through during this 3-week period. The major difference is that the order of intensity is reversed. When an individual, God forbid, suffers the loss of a loved one, it starts with a more intense period. Yesterday we talked about the period of being in onain. That's the most intense, the immediate aftermath of the death itself. And then the stages take us gradually less and less intense, while for the 3-week period, it's just the opposite. Starting off with the 17th of Tammuz, the 3 weeks, there's a certain amount of restrictions and practices of mourning. Then when Rosh Chodesh Av, the beginning of the month of Av, the 9 days begin, there is an increase in the restrictions in the mourning. And then further the afternoon before Tisha B'Av, and then the morning of Tisha B'Av, and then it starts to reverse itself in the afternoon of Tisha B'Av and then the days after. We're going to discuss all of that, but the order is reversed from less intense to more intense. The Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, explains that Avelus Chadasha, that's the term for recent mourning, but it means when an individual, God forbid, suffers the loss of an immediate family relative. So, of course, immediately it is most intense. The grief is most intense. So the practices are the most intense, and then gradually over time it becomes less and less intense. And we're going to study that over the next number of days. But for Avelis Yeshana, for a mourning over something that happened a long time ago, where the entire Jewish people is mourning an event, the destruction of the Second Temple, for example, was almost 2,000 years ago. So that is harder for us to relate to, because none of us, and for hundreds and hundreds of years, no one ever experienced living with the temple, with the Beis HaMikdash. So all of us are mourning something that we never actually experienced. It would be as if a person was mourning the loss of a relative that they never knew that they had, that they never knew about. So we have to build up to it. We start with less intense practices, and gradually it becomes more and more intense. We build up to it in order to be able to feel what that loss means. And that's really what we're doing in discussing these days during these 3 weeks, to try to bring ourselves so that when Tisha B'Av arrives, we will have a deeper appreciation of what we had, what we miss, what we lost, what we hope to get back. We have to build up to it. Often a crucial decision for mourners that they need to face right away after the death of their loved one is the time of the funeral. That's going to determine when the Shiva period begins. Remember, there's a period called Onain, which is from the time of death until the end of the funeral, and the end of the funeral starts the 7-day period of Shiva. So deciding when the funeral is going to be is a critical decision that's got to be made right away. The Torah says, Ki kavar sikvarenu bayomahu. A person that passed away, they should be buried right away, as soon as possible. If it is possible to arrange, even the same day. That sets the rule that we try to arrange for the funeral as soon as possible. And the only reason to delay the scheduling of funeral is for kavod hames, honor to the deceased. Now, this is a concept we're going to refer to very often over the next number of days. One of the major themes of all of the practices, Jewish practices of mourning and loss and grief, will relate to kavod hames, showing honor to the deceased. So, if delaying the funeral will show greater honor to the deceased, that's a permissible or legitimate reason to delay by a day or two. So, for example, if a person decides or a family decides that someone who passed away is going to be buried in Israel, that is necessarily going to cause a delay. It could take a day or two longer to arrange all of that. Well, that's a legitimate reason because it is an honor to a deceased to be buried in Israel. It's not a requirement, but it is an honor. So that would be a legitimate reason to delay the actual funeral itself. Another aspect of kavod hames, honor to the deceased, would be to allow time for immediate relatives to gather. Let's say children are in different places immediate family relatives are in different places, and it takes time to arrange, to drive, to fly. A person might be very far away. And we're talking about a relative that if they were not present, it would not be honor to the deceased, and it would be greater honor to the deceased if that person were present. Certainly that applies, if it's possible, to those people who are actually the mourners, people, the children, the siblings, the immediate family members. However, when a funeral is scheduled with a delay, a day or two or even more, simply because it's more convenient, then that is not an honor to the deceased, and that is not a legitimate reason to delay a funeral. Honor to the deceased means when someone passes away, life is interrupted. Everything stops. Everything is put on hold. I may have a very important meeting, I may have a very important task, but if I'm faced with this, everything else gets put aside. That's honor to the deceased. And if the delay is simply to make it more convenient, if someone says, well, yes, I'm traveling to the funeral, but I have a meeting, I want to take care of this, I have this obligation, I'm not willing to simply stop everything and immediately travel, that then becomes a matter of convenience and is not honor to the deceased. If someone decides a person passed away, let's say on a Wednesday or even a Thursday, and they decide, you know what, we're going to delay the funeral until Sunday because it's easier for people to attend a funeral if it's on Sunday. People don't have to take off from work as if it would be a weekday. That's not considered honor to the deceased. That's considered for convenience reason, and that is the opposite of honor to the deceased. Now, in addition to this reason of wanting to have the burial, the funeral, as quickly as possible because of honor to the deceased, our sages, particularly those who are more in tune with Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, they describe the pain and the anguish that a neshama, a soul, feels until the time of burial. The burial is, from a mystical point of view, something that brings comfort to the neshama, to the soul of the person that passed away. So, the sooner we are able to hold that funeral, the sooner the soul, the neshama, is able to find comfort. So, it's a long way of saying it's very important to decide the time of the funeral. It should not be too soon to interfere with honor to the deceased, but it should also not be too late, which would impede honor to the deceased. There's an increasingly common scenario today where some immediate family members will not be able to be present at the funeral. For example, someone lives far away and they're not able to travel. Or, for example, if someone passes away, let's say here, and they're going to be buried in Israel, maybe not all the family is able to accompany the body for the funeral. So in that case, there's a complicated question when people are living in different time zones. When does a person start Shiva? Remember what we explained yesterday, that when a person is an onain, the immediate period between the death and the funeral, a person is exempted from all positive commandments in order to attend to the burial. So there are no prayers. We don't sit Shiva, we don't do any positive commandments because we're attending to the burial. Well, What happens if I'm in a situation where I'm not going to be involved in the burial? I'm not making any funeral arrangements. I'm not going to be at the funeral. I have no involvement whatsoever. Well, maybe I don't have to wait until the actual burial, which I'm not going to witness, in order to start sitting Shiva. So this is a complicated question in Jewish law, and there are a lot of different factors. But today, the situation has changed as a result of Zoom and FaceTime. So it is possible to be virtually present at a funeral, even if physically a person is very far away. That often can lead to the situation that in general, it is preferable for all family members to start Shiva at the same time when the funeral is completed. So they start Shiva on the same day and they end Shiva on the same day, even if they're in different locations. Again, there can be exceptions to this rule. It is a complicated subject, but it's something that comes up often, and in these situations, a rabbi who is an expert in these laws should be consulted. Here's a very practical suggestion. If you attend a funeral, please sign the guest book. I want to confess, I never did that. I never considered it important to do. But I found when my father passed away and the funeral home gave us the book where people had signed in, I found that it was very, very meaningful to me. And I read it and appreciated every person that came, and I was able to appreciate, even if at the funeral itself I didn't see them because, of course, I was preoccupied. I wasn't obviously able to see everyone who was there, and it was very meaningful. And since that time, I try to be careful to do that. If I attend a funeral, sign the guest book. It's a very, very helpful suggestion. Another decision that mourners must make very quickly is choosing a casket in which the person will be buried. Now, in some places, the Jewish practice is not to use a casket at all. For example, in Israel, in many places in Israel, the practice is not to use any casket. The body is wrapped in a tallis and is buried. However, outside of Israel, in most places, the Jewish practice is to use a casket. And in choosing a casket, there is a fundamental value that is expressed already in the Talmud. There should not be a difference between Jews of greater and lesser wealth. The simplest is the best. It is not the case, from a Jewish point of view, that how much you spend on the casket, let's say for a parent, reflects how much you love them. That is not the case. When it comes to the casket, simplest is best. Some people are very reluctant to discuss or to decide any of these questions or issues in advance. And I understand that. At the same time, my experience is that it is much better to discuss and to decide as much as possible in advance, to have plots, to decide on a funeral home, decide on the type of casket a person wants, consider where the Shiva will be held. Whatever decisions or discussions are possible to have in advance, it is helpful, I find, because it reduces stress at the time of the person's passing. And that stress sometimes can lead, unfortunately, to machlokas, to disputes, to disagreements, and even angry words. When a person, for example, mourners, are under stress and it's an emotional time, sometimes it can bring out not the best in people. And therefore, I find that it's very good to plan as much as possible in advance. It makes things much calmer and much smoother at a very emotional time of upheaval. I clearly remember the first time this happened to me, and it's happened several times since. A woman I did not know called me, and she said, "I have my plot at ADATH. I am sick." She had a terminal illness. "You will be officiating at my funeral," she said to me, "and I would like for you to meet me and to know me now while I'm alive, not just to hear about me when you're preparing my eulogy." So the first time this happened, I was taken aback. But it turned out that our discussion was not morbid, which is what I initially feared, but it was extremely life-affirming, even joyous. We had a number of conversations, and it caused this woman to think about her life, think about what she had accomplished, what she was proud of. It was a very positive experience. And when I saw how it worked out, it makes a lot of sense, and I appreciated it. I do want to make it clear that this is not a solicitation in any way, but it's just a general suggestion to think about these things, to come to some decisions. It helps things more smoothly when the time comes. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you all soon in person.